In this video tutorial, we're going to have a look at creating a wireframe for a fictional mobile application using a very simple free online wireframing tool called wireframe.cc. And in this particular case, for this example, I've just chosen this staff management mobile app scenario, which we're going to work through. And so up here on the screen, I've written out some of the functional requirements and just a summary of them because I'm not going to wireframe the entire application. But this staff management mobile app, very generic, not for a particular company or anything, but it's going to have a login screen. It's going to have some sort of news or announcements section where you can sort of browse through previous announcements or news that have been posted by the company. It's going to have some sort of document management section, and then it's going to obviously focus on staff management, so having listings of staff members for things like contact information, salary amounts, whatever it happens to be. And then I've gone through and I've broken down some of the specific functional requirements for that, almost like a series of use cases for this application, but not for the entire app. So I'm not looking at everything inside scope, just one particular area. So what do we need for the staff management? We're going to need to be able to view all the staff. So being able to view a list of all of the staff members. We're going to be able to need to view one specific staff member. And then you might notice that there are two different listings for view one. There's a summary and then there's full information. So the idea is that with this particular application, there'll be two different categories of users. So there'll be some sort of like manager user who will be able to have access to more stuff. And then there'll be a generic staff user who might not have access to absolutely everything, which is very common inside web apps, mobile apps, whatever, where you have some sort of role-based access control where some people get more access than other people. So we're going to have view all as a list. We're going to have view one staff member, both as a bit of a summary for unprivileged users, and then the full information for someone who is a manager. And then once again, if you are the higher privileged manager, you might also be able to add, edit, and delete staff members as well. So what I'll do here is I'll just mark out the privileged screens of the application. I was going to call them endpoints, but that's a bit API-ish. So viewing all people is going to be something which general staff and managers can do. Viewing the summary of one person would be an unprivileged kind of action. But then view one, viewing the full information, this would be a privileged manager only action. Adding a new user or a staff member, editing someone and deleting. So these things that I've marked with asterisks would be for privileged users or managers, whatever you want to call them in our case. Now, over on the right-hand side, you'll see that I have put together some very low fidelity, which is a fancy way of saying very dodgily drawn. This is kind of a storyboard that I've put over on the right here. So obviously this is just hand sketched using my little on-screen drawing tool here. And it's not showing every single screen of the app. So it's not even showing all of the staff management, but it's enough for you to get an idea of the flow of the application or the story of the app. So how a user would flow through it. So we've got a login screen over here. Obviously that would be the starting point of the app. Until someone is logged in, they're not going to get access to any other functionality. They'd have some sort of landing screen, some sort of home screen. So I've just called it home here, which is pretty common. That, you know, it's a quick access point off to different areas of functionality. So basically there's a little bit of a title here and a few buttons that sort of point off to different functionality. And you can see that from the home screen onwards, all of them are going to have this bottom tab navigation structure down the bottom, which is again very common in mobile apps, where you've got a little a bottom sort of footer area, which has some icons in it pointing off to different functionality. Now these are very, very poorly drawn icons, but basically they'd be home, notifications, or what I've called news, and then document management, and then anything to do with staff. So just those four areas that I've kind of outlined before. So I'm ignoring in my storyboard and in what I'm going to wireframe using this online tool, I'm not going to worry about news. I'm not going to worry about documents. I'm only going to focus on the login screen, the home screen, and then the staff functionality. Obviously, whatever you learn through wireframing a few screens, you can roll out to all the rest of the functionality because you'll know how to use the tool really well by that stage. So you can see over here, I've got a listing of all of the staff. So this would be view all as a list. So we've got a little logo up the top left. Up on the top right, there's just an icon indicating like a profile area, account profile of the logged in person. We've got a little title here, and then we've got a listing of all the staff members. And this is definitely a low fidelity storyboard that I've put here. As you can see, I haven't even put many words into it. So it's only the major titles that I've put in. And obviously it does need some explanation, which is why I'm talking about it now, to say what each of these components are. So we can see that these are going to be images. And so we're assuming, because it's a list of staff members, they're probably staff photos, right? Profile pictures. And these details over here is going to be, a staff member's name, but it also might be something like an email address, phone number, whatever other information is useful to see at a glance as a summary. These little icons over here are just going to be for editing a staff member and deleting a staff member. So quick actions for a manager who's logged in to be able to get directly across to something like, editing a staff member or deleting them. So you can see over here as well, I've got a screen for viewing one staff member. So not viewing all of them, but zoning in and focusing on one person and getting the full information about one staff member instead of just a summary. So over here, I was talking about just like a name, email address, and phone number. But down here, we might be talking about all of those details, but the department they're in, their job title, their position description, their salary information, whatever else you wanted to be storing about these staff members. Secret notes that the managers keep on staff, whatever it happens to be. And then down here as well, we can see an add staff screen, which is basically just going to be all the fields that relate to a staff member if you were adding them into the system. And we've just got a bunch of different text boxes. And this one here is supposed to be a drop-down list. But again, very sketchy, very low fidelity, so very low detail, low quality. But it's just a starting point so that you can visualize the application that's being put together. And honestly, I think that this is a fantastic place to start because it's a sketch, right? You grab a piece of paper, you sketch it out, and at least you've got a starting point. Now you've got something to focus on when you go and use a proper tool to go and design your wireframes or prototypes or design concepts or whatever it is that you're doing. So I think this is a fantastic place to start. So let's get into wireframing. Now there are a lot of different tools that you can use to do wireframing, and the one that I'm going to look at with you is a tool called wireframe.cc. So literally just go to wireframe.cc in your browser of choice. I'm using Chrome, but it really does not matter what you're using. And this is a free tool, free in-browser web-based tool, which we can use to create wireframes. And it is an incredibly simple tool, not just to use, but I mean, its range of functionality is very, very small. And that sounds like it's not a selling point, but it is. So from the previous video where I was comparing different ways of representing a user interface design, so we're talking about storyboards, wireframes, design concepts, and prototypes. One of the things about wireframes is that they should be limited. Remember that wireframes should never be concerned with color. They should never be concerned with typography or fonts. They should never be concerned with specific images. They are just purely for seeing the rough layout of different screens or pages of an app, where things are going to be positioned, what the main elements of these screens or pages are. They're not meant to be high fidelity, high detail, and they're not supposed to be worried about colors and typography and whatever. That's the job of a design concept or a high fidelity prototype. Wireframing, if you're doing colors and typography and things like that, you're doing wireframes wrong. That is not their job. That's not their purpose. And quite frankly, you're wasting time. Remember that the wireframes, what's so good about wireframes being low effort and very low quality is that we are willing to change them. That's the point. So we're supposed to be acting in a more agile way where we can go and put together a wireframe, show it to the client, and then the client says, "No, I don't. That's not what I was thinking about these particular screens." Or, "Can you show me where these screens are because I can't see them in here?" Or, "I was expecting there'd be a button here." Or, "How does someone get to their profile?" And if we haven't invested that much time and effort into the wireframe, we're really happy to make changes. And in fact, if it's really quick and easy for us to make changes, we might be able to make them with the client, during the meeting, collaboratively actually making these changes. So we don't want to be worried about color, typography, whatever else. Wireframes are just gray or black and white. The fonts, they don't matter. Big text is a heading. Small text is some sort of detail or body text. That's it. Images, if they're really, really important images like icons, you can put them in, but otherwise it's just a box with a cross through it, remember? So purposely keep these low detail, low fidelity. And wireframe.cc is a tool that is limited on purpose. And so in my opinion, I think that's a really good thing because it limits you. If you're creating wireframes in something like Photoshop, for example, not only is life going to be harder for you to start with, but it's going to subtly draw you into making things pixel perfect or introducing colors and styles and things like that. Wireframe.cc has so few options and customizability that you're forced to do things in quite a simple way, which is good. However, you don't have to create wireframes using wireframe.cc. There are so many different specific wireframing tools available, both free and paid. You can also use things like PowerPoint if you want to. So if you have Microsoft PowerPoint or something, there are actually storyboarding or wireframing tools inside there. And of course, you basically can use any image editor. But I recommend you to use something like this. You might have also come across draw.io, which is a very popular diagramming tool, and you can make really good wireframes in that. But again, it has a lot more options available. It has a lot more shapes. It has a lot more customizability, and that is not a good thing for wireframes. So if you want to use draw.io, for sure, it's a nice free tool. But wireframe.cc, especially for a sort of quick wireframe, I don't think you can go past it, or it's definitely worthwhile learning. Now, before we go into it too far, I will also say that wireframe.cc does have a paid version as well. So there is a free version, which I'm in at the moment. I'm not signed in or anything. So this is what you will see when you first go to wireframe.cc. But there is a paid version as well, which here's the comparison of the two. So in the free version, you don't have a user account, so you're not logged in. Everything you create is therefore public. So that's a bit of a downside because you can go into someone else's wireframe and start editing it. And you're limited to single page wireframes, which is fine for us. In the paid version, you can keep wireframes private, which obviously, if you're doing this longer term, is a good idea. You can also have what they call multi-page wireframes. So basically, we're designing an app that's made up of, say, 10 wireframes. And so you can start to make it one wireframe of 10 different screens or 10 different pages, 10 different apps. Sorry, a wireframe for one app, but multiple different screens or pages within that. And you can start to make them clickable. So this starts to turn them into very basic interactive prototypes as well. Now, in the last video, I said that my personal preference for prototypes for apps and websites would be Figma because I get a lot more control over design and interaction. But if you just want to grab some wireframes and make them interactive, wireframe.cc, the paid version, can do that. They've also got, revision control. They have better export options, and they also have the concept of using master pages, which is basically using a template across multiple screens. So if you think it's going to be worthwhile for you and you really like this tool, go for it. But for me, I'm just using the free version. All right, let's get into it. So wireframe.cc. Every action starts with a click and drag. So if I have all, and at the moment I've just got this desktop app open, which I'll show you for a bit of playing around, then I'll undo and I'll go back and try to create a mobile app to match our project. So everything that you do in wireframe.cc is just going to be a click and drag operation. So if I click and drag this landscape rectangle here, as soon as I release after clicking and dragging, wireframe.cc says, well, what do you want this rectangle to be? Is it just a box, which is just an empty rectangle? Or is it supposed to be some sort of circle or ellipse at that stage? Or is it supposed to be an icon? So, I mean, it might be better if I made a smaller one. So is this supposed to be some icon? And so we can go through and choose from either material design or font awesome icons, and we'll see that in action a bit later. So if I put in something like that, or is it supposed to be an image placeholder? So you can see that straight away, that just makes the rectangle with a cross through it. Or is it supposed to be some text? So this is an actual editable text box where we can type something into the text box. Or is it supposed to be a generic paragraph? So if you look at this one, this is not text that I'm typing, but it's just representing, hey, here's a paragraph of text. I can't be bothered going and typing out a paragraph of text and it's not relevant. So here is a placeholder for text. So when we go in and we talk about the text tool, that's text that we're typing. So that's perfect for labels that we want someone to read or headings or whatever. But if you can't be bothered writing out the text and you just want to say, look, I just want a placeholder for a paragraph, then you use paragraph. Same as if you want a placeholder for a bullet list, you just select bullet list over here or list. If you want to put in a headline or a heading, you can just click and drag and say, I want this to be a headline. And so you can see that that just kind of puts in larger blocks. And so if you're looking at this, you kind of go, okay, well, yeah, I can see what you're talking about. I can see that this is supposed to be a heading or a headline. I can see that it's a paragraph. I can see that this is a list at that stage. And that's taken me all of, 10 seconds to put in 3 items. What else have we got here? We've also got a text input. So text input we'll use later on with our forms, but you'll see if I put in a text input, it's basically just a rectangle that's not editable, but it just comes with a little line which is meant to indicate a cursor. So, someone can type into this box instead of it just being a general rectangle. And similar to that, I shouldn't have deleted that. I'll just leave that there. And similar to that, what else have we got? We've also got progress bars and drop-down lists, things like that, and we've got annotations. I was going to say a call out, but an annotation is a note, so a way that you can add comments in about your design if you want to as well. Now, one other thing that I will notice, and you might have noticed this if you were really observant already, sometimes I had options available that I didn't have other times. So if I just do a really small little square like this, this is my basic set of options that I've got available. But you might notice that things like a scroll bar or a drop-down list or a progress bar are not mentioned here at the moment. But if I draw this out as more of a skinny rectangle, and importantly a horizontal skinny rectangle, you might notice that now it's like wireframe.cc is saying, oh, would you like this to be a dividing line or some sort of slider control, so a range where you can drag it across, or a progress bar or a drop-down list or a scroll bar. Because of the way that I've drawn out this box, it's actually giving me different options depending on if I make something that's very, very landscape, very horizontal, or something that's very, very vertical. So for example, if I put in a scroll bar, obviously that only makes sense if I'm putting in something which is horizontal. If I go and put in a vertical rectangle like this, you can see that my options are very, very different. I don't get options for things like headlines or text inputs or anything else, but instead I get a vertical dividing line or a vertical scroll bar in that case. So just be aware that depending on the size and the shape of the box that you draw, you will get different options. So if I want a vertical scroll bar down the side of my page, well, I'm going to go through and draw out where the vertical scroll bar is supposed to appear and then select vertical scroll bar. You know, if I want something to be a horizontal headline, of course I'm going to draw out a horizontal box and say, well, that's going to be my headline at that point. So make sure that in wireframe.cc that you are clicking and dragging the area where you can visualize that that's going to go. So if you want, you know, this large box area to be an image, make sure you select the right kind of area first, and then you'll get the right options appearing. So that's the first and most important part about wireframe.cc. Click and drag a box and then tell wireframe.cc what that box is supposed to be. And be careful about whether you're drawing something very landscape or very portrait, because that will change the options that are available to you. Now, the next stage would be customizing what we've got. Now, this ellipse down here that I created, maybe that's not the right size or, you know, dimensions for what I actually wanted. So of course I can go back and click select that particular shape, that particular element, and I can resize it. So if I grab one of these resizing handles on the right or left hand sides, I can click and drag that and change the shape. Of course, I can also grab the bottom right or bottom left or whatever, one of the corner handles, and I can resize this in both dimensions. Now, this is good if you want to do that, but quite often you'll want to resize something but not make it wider or taller than it once was. And here's a good example of that. If I go and draw a really nice square, so if I start here and I draw out, you know, some little square like this, so you can see that that's basically a 2x2 grid there, and I tell it to be an ellipse or a circle. Now, if I want that circle to be larger, but I just click and drag this handle, you might notice that that's not a perfect circle anymore because it's becoming stretched out in one way or another. So if you want to resize things, I would recommend holding down the Shift key when you're resizing. And this is something that's very common to a lot of applications. If you hold down the Shift key, the aspect ratio or the proportions are going to be locked in place. So you can see that it doesn't matter where I move my cursor to, the shape is maintaining its proportions. So the width and the height are being the same. And so it's basically still a circle, but it's just getting bigger and bigger. It's not turning into an oval. So that's holding down the Shift key. If you hold down the Alt key when you're resizing, no, it might not work at the moment, but you might be able to get it to resize from a center point as well. But yeah, hold down the Shift key, and that's going to resize, maintaining proportions, which is really nice. What else have we got? So resizing, and with all these things, if you're not familiar with these tools or you haven't played around with other diagramming or image editing tools before, this stuff might feel very uncomfortable to you. The way you get around that is by playing with it. You just keep playing around with it, messing up, and then eventually you will get comfortable with the tool. So don't feel afraid to just play around with things. Control Z, I should have mentioned that beforehand. Control Z is undo, just like it is in most applications. So if you do something and you're like, oh, that's not what I wanted, Control Z, and it will just undo the last action. So feel free to play around with it, make mistakes, that's completely fine. That's how you learn these programs. What else have we got? So if I select one of these shapes, and then if I click again, or if I double click on it, you'll see that I start getting some options appearing. Now, because I double clicked in the middle of this shape, you might see that I've got a flashing cursor where I can type something in here. So you can add text directly to shapes like circles, ellipses, or rectangles. So you can add text directly inside instead of overlaying text on top of a shape. So that's useful. But the other thing is that you might notice that when I had this shape selected, and once I double clicked on it, I actually got some formatting options. For example, I can change things like the line thickness around the outside. So I can change the border thickness of this shape. I can also change the colors within a very, very, very limited color palette of both the fill and the border colors, or the fill and the stroke colors, or the outline. Now, the color palette. This is really important. Your colors are limited to white, black, the grays in between, transparent, and red or tomato, right? That's it. No blues, greens, yellows, oranges, whatever. None of those colors exist in wireframe.cc, and that is a good thing. Because if you don't have those colors available, you don't get distracted with choosing colors. And more importantly, your client knows that you're not trying to mess with colors. If I hand something which is completely gray back to my client as a wireframe, they're not going to be focusing on colors. Or we can just say, look, wireframes aren't about color and typography and images. This is just to show layout. If you start to use colors and you start to mess around with details, your client will start giving you design feedback. And that is not helpful when it's not a design concept. If we're just talking about structural positioning and stuff like that, we don't want comments about colors and fonts and whatever else, right? That's later. That's too detailed for us now. So these are the colors you're limited to. So obviously, you just use white and you use black and you use grays wherever it happens to be appropriate. If you need something to be transparent, as in it disappears, like for example, the fill color here, we can just turn it to transparent and then there is no fill color. So obviously that's just a practical color to have. And then tomato, I personally use it when I need to highlight something. So it might be that it's what we call a call to action button. Like for example, the login screen, if there's one main button on the login screen and I want to draw someone's attention to that, I might make it red, right? Or this tomato color. If there is a navigation object, so something like a menu or a drop-down list, and I want to show that a particular item has been selected or is active, I might make that red. Not because the final design is going to have it as being red, but because I'm trying to show that it's in an active state. That's the currently selected item at that stage. So I'm not using this tomato red color because it's the tomato red color, but I'm using it as a highlight, some sort of like active draw attention to this particular part. And I would encourage you guys to do the same. So use black, use white, use gray for all, your different components. If you need to draw attention to something, you can use the tomato color for the text, for fill, for outline, whatever it happens to be. Now, I'm just going to play with some of these settings. So we've looked at the line thickness or the stroke width around the outside of the shape. You can see that when I'm clicking these colors, it's changing the fill of the shape. It's not changing the stroke or the outline, the border. If you want to change the alternate color, you click on this little symbol and you can see that it's toggling between the fill color and the stroke color. And so now if I change the color, it's changing the border color or the stroke color instead of the fill color. So just click that little icon there and now I'm changing the other, whatever the alternate color is. If I wanted to change the text color, I would go and double click on the text that I've got there and type something if it's not there currently. If I select the text, I can now change the format of the text that's there. Notice that these are very different format options to the shape. So if I click off the text and back onto the shape, I've got the formatting options for the shape. If I double click and select the text, I've got the formatting options for the text of the shape. They're basically different layers. There's text inside the shape, then there's the shape, and then there's the canvas that we're drawing on. So you've got to make sure that you've got the right object selected at the time. So this little slider is just to make the text bigger and smaller. So that's quite useful. And again, you don't get finite control over this, or fine control. You've just got these notches, these different rough sizes, and that's fine, right? We don't need to say, oh, this is going to be, 14 pixel font size or something like that. We just need to just go, yep, that's about big enough for this shape. No problems. Very basic formatting options about bold, italics, and underline. You've got some alignment controls as well. So justified, right, center, and left aligned. So, and obviously by default, for something like a circle, it's just centered by default. We also have the text color, which is what I came in here to change originally. So I'm going to change that to white. Now I can't tell what the text color is because I currently have the text selected. But if I click back off the text onto the shape, you can see that my text color has now changed. So I'll go back in and edit the text again. What else have we got? And we've got clear formatting as well. So just whatever formatting you've done, remove it, set it back to defaults. Under the little ellipsis or vertical, what we often call a kebab menu, so 3 little dots stacked on each other. And there are a few other controls in here. So there is a line height control. Now, this doesn't make any sense because I've only got one line, but if we have something like a paragraph of text, this is very useful to spread the lines out from each other. And we also have all caps and small caps as formatting too. So you can see those formatting options coming in there. So small caps and all caps. And then we've got some list options too. So if you want to change it into a bullet list or a numbered list, you can change those in there as well. But beyond that, that's it. So there's no letter spacing or kerning or anything like that. There's no font selection, so you're limited in the actual font that you can use for this, which again is perfect because that is not what we're focusing on. And of course, you notice that the text colors, you're limited to the same palette of white through to black and then tomato added onto that. Now that's going to be similar for our other shapes as well. So if I go and select this rectangle, it's very similar, except if you're super observant, you might have noticed that there are little circles in the corners as well. So just inside the resize handles, there's a little circle just sitting there. If I grab that circle and drag it, you can see that I end up rounding the corners of the rectangle. Now that's quite useful. I quite like rounded rectangles for some things. And you might also use it because, stylistically, you might need to show that something is rounded. You just might prefer it. But anyway, it's very, very easy to go and round your rectangles. And of course, resizing, same trick, grab one of the corner resize handles. If you want to keep the proportions the same, hold down the Shift key. And so you can see that those proportions are locked in place. If you click again on the shape or double click somewhere on it, you're going to get the formatting options for the shape. So same things about the border thickness, the fill and border colors. And again, if you double click on the shape, you do have the ability of adding text. Now I've put an icon right over the top, so I'll just move that out of the way. But yeah, we do have the ability of adding text to this shape, and then we've got the same, formatting options again. So all of that, same. So there we go. So there you go. I've got a fake button in place now with a beautiful icon sitting in there. Look at that. What a classy button. So if you did want to do things like create buttons, now if you're doing something like this where you're drawing out the button, you're adding text to it, you're adding icons, this is very, very clear communication to your client or to developers or whoever you're doing this for. But remember, we are being pickier now, so we are potentially wasting time. So I would encourage you guys not to do too much detail. Remember, it's not a design concept, it's a wireframe, so it's for a rough idea of what each screen is going to look like. But yeah, that's it. As we go through different shapes or different elements, we will see different formatting options as well, but we'll look at that as we go through the actual wireframe. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to press Control A or Command A if you're on a Mac to select everything, and I'm just going to delete them all. So hit your delete key. So I'll clear this out entirely. And we're now going to focus on some other bits and pieces about the tool. So up in the very top left, you can add a different window frame to give an idea of the context of your particular app or your wireframe. So if we make this no frame, it basically is just an empty canvas. It doesn't really indicate that it's a browser window or a mobile app or whatever. But if we go for the default option, which is basically some sort of desktop app window, you can see that we've got this little toolbar up the top with the little window controls on it for maximize and close and things like that. We can go to the next one, which is a tablet view, or the next one, which is a classic kind of phone view. Now, again, we're not too worried about things like, oh, what particular model of phone is this? Is it a Samsung Galaxy blah, 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 or is it an iPhone? who cares, right? It doesn't matter. This is just a generic phone-sized screen to give an idea of what our app might look like on a phone screen. Now, what is important though is that designing for a portrait phone screen is not the same as a landscape phone screen. So you can hit this little toggle over here to change it from portrait to landscape. Now that is important because your design, the layout, the wireframe might change depending on if it's a portrait phone or a landscape phone, or a portrait or a landscape tablet, right? There are very big differences with those particular designs. So yeah, I do recommend that you play around with this. For this one, I'm going to design everything as a portrait phone size screen. Phones generally, by default, are held in portrait mode, and you generally want to think about how to design them for someone holding it with one hand to start with, and then you can work your way up and design for bigger screens. There is a design concept or a methodology referred to as mobile first design, which basically means design for the smallest mobile device first, and then work your way up to bigger and bigger and bigger screens. So basically start with a phone or possibly a smartwatch or something, but start with a phone, work up to a tablet, work up to a laptop, work up to a desktop. Because if you're focusing on the smallest thing first, you're really thinking about how to use your screen real estate or the space that's available to elements for your screen. When you get to a bigger screen, great, you've got more room. So I often say it's like moving from a 1-bedroom apartment into a 2-bedroom apartment. The problem is that you've got too much space. So where are you going to rearrange and spread things out? But it's much easier if you design for the smallest, most compact screen first, because you have to focus on where the most important elements go. When you get to a bigger and bigger screen or a bigger and bigger device, great, you've got more space. It's more relaxed. If you design for the biggest thing first and then try to go for a small screen, you've got this problem like moving from a 5-bedroom house to a 1-bedroom apartment. Well, where does all my stuff go? You know, I've got 3 of these items. I only need 1 of them. How am I going to, manage all of this space? Because we're trying to make it into a compact area. So mobile first design for your smallest screen first and build your way up. Now, in this particular tutorial, I'm not building out all the screens of this app, and I'm also only going to be designing for a portrait phone, not for, a landscape tablet or something as well. But of course, you can just use the steps that you learn here and extend it. Go for a landscape phone, go for a portrait tablet, a landscape tablet, desktop, whatever it happens to be. You take the same techniques and you just keep working them out. Over on the right-hand side, we have a button up the top, which is hide and show annotations. So annotations, I showed you very briefly before, where I drew a box and said add annotation. So there's, some comments like this. Now those annotations basically just show up as this weird dotted overlay. And if you mouse over it or you hover over it, the little annotation or the comment appears. Now, if you don't want those little dotted overlays to appear on your design, you just hit that button and it toggles the visibility of them off again. So this can be really useful if you are trying to communicate to designers, developers, clients, whoever, exactly what this area is. But then, of course, you don't want it to mess with the visuals when you're looking at it, so you can just toggle that straight off again. I don't particularly find annotations to be too helpful. I think if your wireframe doesn't communicate something clearly enough, you could probably just have a supporting document with it. But anyway. What else have we got? We've got save. Now, if I save this document, remember that I'm not logged in currently. So when I save it, it just says, sure, your wireframe has been saved, as in it's been saved to the wireframe.cc database or whatever. But because we're not using the premium version, we've got a free version, all we get is a public URL. So this URL here, which is just the wireframe.cc domain name, but with this slash some 6-character code, which is appearing up here in my address bar, this is the access back into that wireframe. So if I, open up a new tab for wireframe.cc, obviously I get a blank wireframe. But if I go and copy the full URL, which includes my wireframe code, my unique code, you'll see that I start editing the same wireframe, and whatever changes I make in one are going to appear in the other, on the other side. And so what you want to do as you move along is take note of all the URLs that you've got for each of your wireframes, because that is going back to your original editable version of the wireframe. Now, this is probably the biggest difference between the free and premium versions. You know, this wireframe has to be public, and all you have is a URL to get back into it. We're not logging into an account. We can't see the previous wireframes that we've created. And so, yeah, so this URL becomes all important if we want to edit this wireframe in the future. And there is a bit of a workaround for that, but yeah, I won't go into it for this. So there's the hide annotations, save. We've also got some options over here. So if you hit the little settings or filter icon, we've got options for, do you want to show the grid? Now, generally speaking, showing the grid is a really good idea when you're building things, because obviously it helps you to visually plan out where your elements are sitting. But if you're showing this to a client, maybe you want to turn off show grid before you take a screenshot, for example, or if you're demonstrating it to them because they don't need the grid. You can also change the grid from being graph paper to being dots. I prefer graph paper. You can also change the size of the grid. So you might want to make that something like a 10 pixel grid, for example, instead of 20 pixels, so that you get finer controls over everything. You can overlay columns. So if you've done some design work before, you might be familiar with using things like a 12 column layout. So quite often when people are designing, they might break things down into 12 columns so that they can break things into chunks more easily. So if I want to make something in halves, I know I've just got to go out by 6 columns. If I want it to be quarters, it's 3 columns. If it's sixth, it's going to be 2 columns. So it just makes it easier to sort of align things. And you might say, okay, well, I want to have 4 columns and versus 8 columns, or 5 columns versus 7 columns. So it's just a way of you proportioning up your screen and making sure that you've got fairly consistent regions of your design. I don't think we need columns for what we're doing, so I'm going to turn those back off again, and instead I'm going to turn the grid back on, but you can use it if you want. Now, there are two very important options in here that I'll come back to in a second. You can also change some colors and styles for the overall canvas. If you want to, you can also override the size of the canvas. So if you want a very specific size because you are trying to model it on a particular viewport or screen size, you can change it in here. You can also just grab the bottom of the canvas area and drag it out as well. So if you don't want it to look exactly like a single phone screen, but you want it to look like, the whole phone layout, then go for it. Just stretch out the bottom of that canvas. So 320 by 480 is what it was set to before. So these two options in here, snap to grid and enable smart guides. By default, smart guides are enabled, snap to grid is turned off. So what you might notice is that when I start drawing something, I'm not being forced to draw against the grid. Now, that might be good or that might be bad, but basically I can draw in between the grid lines. So that's the first option of not having snap to grid turned on. I can draw between the grid lines very easily. Wireframe.cc is not snapping the shape that I'm drawing to one of the grid lines. It will happily let me sit between two grid lines. But what is turned on is enabled smart guides. And so what this does is when I'm drawing something, it's actually going to try to intelligently line up this object with other ones. And if I'm moving something around, so if I select this and move it around, you'll see that it's going to offer to align based on other objects. So when smart guides is turned on, wireframe.cc doesn't care about the grid, but it does care about other shapes and other elements, which is very, very useful. Now, I will often move between using Snap to Grid and using smart guides, but I might actually suggest at the moment that maybe you guys should turn on Snap to Grid instead of smart guides. And that's just because if you start drawing, notice that now I can't draw a shape that sits between the grid lines. And I think that's really going to help you not be too picky about things like positioning. When you're trying to do big layout kind of things, having Snap to Grid turned on is perfect because you can just say, look, the logo is going to appear up here somewhere, right? And you don't have to think about 1 or 2 pixels off or 5 pixels off. It's always going to align to your 10 pixel grid. Later on, when we're doing things like specific alignment of text boxes or something, we might think about using Snap to Grid at that point. Sorry, using turning Snap to Grid off at that point. But I'm going to recommend for you guys, turn on Snap to Grid, and it's going to make your life easier for when you're creating your designs, at least to start with. So until you're purposely doing fine layout work, leave Snap to Grid turned on, and then you can turn it off later. And that's pretty much it. There's also a menu that just allows you to log in or go to their contact screen, which we don't really need to care about. But I do want to just highlight that settings is up there. Feel free to have a look and to change those settings. I've changed my grid size to 10 pixels and I have turned on Snap to Grid. And that's where we're going to start in the next video when we actually start putting together the wireframes for the app that I've already storyboarded.